On a gray Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, the courtroom was already buzzing with impatience. People scrolled on their phones, public defenders whispered to clients, and Judge Richard Halbrook sat at the bench with the self-importance of a man who had worn the robe too long without being challenged. Courtroom 4B was a place where small infractions met oversized egos, and where justice was often served with a side of humiliation. The door creaked open. In walked Danielle Monroe, 45 years old, composed, understated. She wasn't escorted, she wasn't flustered, just late. 12 minutes late, to be exact. To most observers, she looked like another citizen who had taken time off work to deal with a minor traffic citation. No entourage, no legal pad, no fuss. A woman in a navy blazer, hair pulled back, clutching a slim folder. She took a seat in the back without a word. Judge Halbrook didn't look up at first, but when her name was called and she stepped forward, something shifted in his posture. His voice grew sharp, performative. Well, Congresswoman Monroe graces us with her presence. 12 minutes late. Gasps rippled through the room. Some recognized the name. Others just sensed the shift in energy. Danielle didn't argue. She nodded respectfully, apologized briefly, and began to explain. But Halbrook cut her off. "This is my courtroom," he snapped. "You may play politics on the Hill, but in here, you follow my rules. You're fined $500 for contempt. Next case." The silence was thick. Someone in the gallery pulled out a phone and started recording. Danielle stood still, her face calm. She could have walked out, but she didn't, because what Judge Halbrook didn't know was that Danielle Monroe had spent 20 years inside federal courtrooms, arguing constitutional cases and prosecuting white-collar crime. And today, she wasn't going to be the one put on trial. Want to know what happens when a judge tries to humiliate the wrong woman? Press 7 in the comments to keep watching. This is one courtroom story you'll never forget. The gavel struck hard, sharp against the wood. "Contempt," Judge Richard Halbrook barked, his voice echoing across the stale, fluorescent-lit courtroom. "That's a $500 fine. You're excused." The murmurs in courtroom 4B faded into stunned silence. Danielle Monroe, standing alone at the center of the room, did not move. She didn't raise her eyebrows, didn't protest, didn't even blink. Her hands remained clasped calmly in front of her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even and deliberate, "I have documentation from the clerk's office showing the docket time was changed this morning. The clerk's stamp is dated." Halbrook cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I'm not interested in excuses, Ms. Monroe. This is a courtroom, not a campaign stop." It wasn't the first time Judge Halbrook had humiliated someone from the bench. He had a reputation: long-winded lectures, personal jabs, punishing fines that often skirted the line of abuse. He liked control. He thrived on compliance. But today, control was slipping. From the back row, a teenage girl in a hoodie raised her phone. Her screen glowed red as she began to record. Then another phone came up. A man in a suit adjusted his tie and started filming too. There was something different about this exchange. Something sharp, unscripted. The air buzzed. Danielle didn't flinch. She pulled a folded document from her folder and held it up. "This is a certified copy of the court's own docket notice, stamped and filed this morning. It shows the time change. Respectfully, Your Honor, I arrived according to that notice." Halbrook's smirk faltered. "Well, maybe you should have checked the time earlier." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained level. "Respectfully, Your Honor, justice isn't a game of gotcha." More phones were raised now. Some people whispered. Others simply stared. They'd come expecting a routine day of traffic cases. What they were witnessing was a masterclass in composure meeting arrogance head-on. Then came the moment that would echo online for weeks. Danielle reached into her folder again and began to read. Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct, Rule 2.2. "A judge shall uphold and apply the law and shall perform all duties of judicial office fairly and impartially." A hush fell over the courtroom. Halbrook leaned back, visibly rattled. "She's quoting the Judicial Code," someone whispered. Danielle continued. "And Rule 2.8b, a judge shall be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants, jurors, witnesses, lawyers, and others with whom the judge deals in an official capacity." Click, click. Phone cameras captured everything. Her words, his silence, and the unmistakable look of a man suddenly aware that the power dynamic had shifted. Danielle wasn't there to perform. She was there to remind the court and the country what justice actually looks like. By the time the courthouse lights dimmed and Judge Halbrook's nameplate was locked behind chamber doors, the clip had already begun its wildfire spread. Uploaded by a teenager on TikTok and shared across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram within hours, the video of Danielle Monroe, calmly reciting judicial ethics as Judge Halbrook fumbled for control, was everywhere. Late-night talk shows replayed the exchange with theatrical reenactments. Memes flooded social media. Danielle holding the Constitution like a sword, Judge Halbrook drowning in his own gavel. The internet had found its new icon of accountability. But for many, the question came quickly and loudly: who is this woman? It didn't take long for journalists to dig. Within hours, blog headlines popped up. Judge shuts down woman in court, then realizes she helped write the law he ignored. Former prosecutor turns the tables in courtroom showdown. As her resume came into focus, the public's fascination deepened. Danielle Monroe wasn't just a confident woman with a steady voice. She was a former federal prosecutor, a Harvard law graduate, and currently a U.S. Congresswoman pushing a sweeping reform bill aimed at increasing courtroom transparency and judicial accountability. She had once led multi-state investigations into political corruption and had testified before Congress on systemic inequities in local court systems. And yet, when she walked into that courtroom, she was treated like any other woman of color without power or presence. That was the real shock. She didn't pull rank, one pundit said on a primetime panel. She didn't say who she was, she just stood her ground, on the law alone. Editorials poured in, civil rights groups issued statements. Former defendants who had faced similar humiliation in Halbrook's courtroom began to speak out. Danielle hadn't just exposed one judge. She'd sparked a national conversation about race, gender, respect, and the danger of unchecked judicial power. And though she hadn't planned it, she had become a lightning rod for change. One late docket hearing had set off a storm that no one saw coming, especially Judge Halbrook. The moment Danielle Monroe's courtroom exchange with Judge Richard Halbrook went viral, something unexpected began to happen. Inboxes started filling up. First came a message from a young public defender in Savannah, then a retired school teacher, then a single mother from Decatur. Each story different, but with one disturbing thread. They too had been humiliated, silenced, or unfairly penalized in Halbrook's courtroom. At first, Danielle and her team, led by legal strategist Naomi Ellis, read these as isolated accounts, unfortunate but anecdotal. But as the messages kept coming, patterns emerged. Fines that far exceeded guidelines. Cases where white defendants walked free for charges that led to jail time for Black or Latino individuals. Reprimands delivered with venom in open court, especially against women who dared to question procedure. One email stood out. It came from Rachel Kim, a former court clerk who had worked under Halbrook for nearly 7 years. Her message was brief but chilling. "I have files you'll want to see. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to do what you just did." Danielle arranged a private meeting. What Rachel brought with her wasn't hearsay. It was documentation, internal memos, case tracking spreadsheets, even transcripts Halbrook had personally annotated. The documents showed a clear disparity in how justice was applied, depending not on evidence, but on who stood before the bench. To make sense of the data, Danielle brought in Marcus Delaney, a civic tech specialist who had once worked for the State Bar's Oversight Division. Within days, Marcus compiled a damning report. Halbrook issued bench warrants against defendants of color at nearly 3 times the rate of white defendants, often for minor infractions like parking violations or missed court notices due to clerical errors. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was systemic. And Danielle wasn't just the latest victim of an arrogant judge. She was the first one who had refused to shrink. Across the state, people who had once accepted injustice as the price of surviving the system were now watching someone take it on directly. Danielle had opened a door, and behind it was a flood of long-buried truth, ready to rise. What began as whispers and isolated stories was now taking shape into something measurable, undeniable. With Rachel Kim's documents and the analysis from Marcus Delaney, the pieces fell into place like a damning mosaic. Hidden in court dockets, sealed case logs, and misfiled rulings was a pattern of judicial behavior so blatant it was astonishing no one had stopped it sooner. Judge Richard Halbrook, long protected by tenure and political connections, had built a reputation for discipline and efficiency, but the numbers told another story, a story of discrimination disguised as order. Marcus's audit revealed a troubling disparity. Over a 5-year span, Black and Latino defendants were nearly 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines in Halbrook's court, regardless of offense. First-time offenders of color were handed jail time for nonviolent infractions, where white counterparts walked away with warnings or dismissals. Women who pushed back, especially women of color, were disproportionately cited for contempt. Even worse, Halbrook's docket showed signs of selective scheduling. Cases involving politically connected individuals were quietly moved to private sessions off the public calendar. Some defendants had their charges dismissed without explanation, while others, lacking representation, were penalized to the full extent. Danielle Monroe knew what this meant. This wasn't a rogue judge having a bad day. This was a system cloaked in respectability, weaponized against the vulnerable. With the data in hand, Danielle's team prepared a public report. She stepped in front of cameras, not as a victim, but as a legal authority armed with facts. She spoke not with rage, but with precision. We are not just dealing with misconduct. We are dealing with abuse of power, calculated, consistent, and unapologetic. The press conference shook the legal community. Law professors weighed in. Civil rights leaders called for immediate disciplinary action. Court oversight committees, once quiet, announced internal reviews. Danielle's calm stance in that courtroom wasn't an isolated moment. It was the opening shot in a battle for judicial accountability. If you believe power should never be above the law, press 7 in the comments to stand with Danielle. If you don't, press 0 and tell us why. Either way, what comes next could change the court system forever. For a brief moment, it felt like momentum was on Danielle Monroe's side. The public was listening. Journalists were digging deeper. Lawmakers across the aisle were cautiously supporting her push for judicial reform. But in the shadows of the same institutions she sought to challenge, wheels were turning, quietly, deliberately. It began with a leak. A heavily redacted case file appeared in a political blog known for its connections to courthouse insiders. The headline was designed to sting. Congresswoman Danielle Monroe once dropped corruption case involving major donor, conflict of interest or cover-up. The article accused Danielle of having dismissed a high-profile financial crimes investigation years earlier while serving as a federal prosecutor. The implication? She played favorites. The timing couldn't have been more calculated. Within hours, cable news networks seized the narrative. Talking heads questioned her ethics. Opposing lawmakers demanded a review of her case history. Commentators who had once praised her poise in the courtroom now wondered aloud whether she had her own record to answer for. Danielle's team was stunned, but not surprised. Naomi Ellis, her lead strategist, recognized it for what it was: retaliation. This isn't about a mistake, Naomi said. It's about silencing the woman who spoke too clearly, too publicly. The threat wasn't just to her reputation, it was personal. Online vitriol surged. Threats poured in. A former colleague even backed out of a planned public appearance with her, afraid of the backlash. But Danielle didn't retreat. Instead, she called a press conference. There, in front of dozens of cameras, she released the full, unredacted case file. It showed that she had recused herself from the corruption investigation in question due to a legally required conflict of interest. Not misconduct, but ethical transparency. The case had been reassigned, investigated, and ultimately prosecuted by a separate office. If you're going to come for my integrity, she said, bring the whole truth, not just what fits your fear. Her words hit harder than any viral clip. The court had struck back, but Danielle had just proven she wasn't only fighting for justice. She was justice, with nothing to hide and everything to stand for. The ornate hearing room at the State Judicial Oversight Committee was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras pointed like loaded questions, while rows of citizens, many of whom had never set foot in a courtroom, waited in silence. This wasn't just a disciplinary proceeding, it was a reckoning. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Halbrook, no longer on his bench but behind a small wooden desk, eyes steely, lips drawn tight. Gone was the commanding presence, the gavel-wielding authority. In its place was a man visibly irritated at having to explain himself. And facing him, seated calmly in a navy suit, was Danielle Monroe. Not as a litigant, not as an adversary, but as a witness. Her opening statement was brief but powerful. "I'm not here because I want revenge," she said. "I'm here because too many people walk into courtrooms not knowing their rights, and too many judges count on that." The committee, composed of retired judges, legal scholars, and citizen appointees, listened intently as Danielle laid out her findings. Data, transcripts, testimonies. With the help of Naomi Ellis, Rachel Kim, and Marcus Delaney, she had built a case that went far beyond her own experience. It exposed a pattern of punitive rulings, racial disparities, and unethical scheduling that painted Halbrook not as a stern judge, but as a manipulator of justice. When Halbrook was called to testify, he dismissed the data as statistical noise and called Danielle a political opportunist with a camera crew. But the damage was done. One by one, witnesses from the community took the stand. A single mother fined for asking a question, a veteran humiliated for needing an interpreter, a public defender reprimanded for objecting. Each voice added weight. Each story became evidence. By the end of the day, the committee wasn't just investigating misconduct. They were listening to a movement. The courtroom had changed. The judge had changed seats. And for the first time in his career, Halbrook was the one being judged. The deliberation didn't take long. After weeks of review, hours of testimony, and mountains of data, the State Judicial Oversight Committee returned to the chamber with their decision. The packed room, journalists shoulder to shoulder, former defendants sitting beside legal scholars, and Danielle Monroe in the front row, fell silent. The committee chair, a former Supreme Court justice herself, stood and cleared her throat. "After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented," she began, "this committee finds that Judge Richard Halbrook has committed repeated violations of judicial ethics, including but not limited to abuse of power, disproportionate sentencing, racial bias in courtroom behavior, and obstruction of access to fair legal recourse." She paused to let the words sink in. "It is the unanimous decision of this panel that Judge Halbrook be immediately removed from the bench, disbarred from future judicial service in the state of Georgia, and referred for federal investigation into potential civil rights violations." There was no eruption of applause, only the release of a collective breath held for too long. For many in the room, it was the first time they had seen the system turn inward and actually correct itself. For those who had been wronged by Halbrook, it wasn't just justice, it was validation. But just as the gavel was raised to adjourn the hearing, the committee chair spoke again. "There is one more matter the committee would like to bring to public record," she said, lifting a thick envelope marked "Confidential." "In the course of this investigation, we obtained documents revealing that Judge Halbrook was actively lobbying behind the scenes against pending federal legislation, specifically the Judicial Transparency and Fairness Act, introduced last year by Congresswoman Danielle Monroe." The room stirred, eyebrows raised. Reporters sat up straight. According to the documents, Halbrook had written under a pseudonym to judicial trade journals, contributed to shadow campaigns to discredit the bill's sponsors, and quietly advised local politicians to stall its passage. His reason? The bill would require judges across the country to disclose sentencing records, recusal patterns, and demographic data, the very mechanisms that had exposed his misconduct. Danielle didn't react with shock. She had suspected as much. But now there was proof. Halbrook hadn't just wanted to punish her in court. He'd wanted to silence a movement before it could begin. But his plan backfired. In the weeks that followed the hearing, national attention intensified. Danielle's bill, once stalled in committee, was catapulted into public consciousness. Law Judge Halbrook lost his seat. Danielle gained more than vindication. She gained momentum. And in the end, it was the woman he tried to shame. Months after the gavel fell on Judge Richard Halbrook's career, the courtroom where it all began had changed. The bench no longer echoed with arrogance. A new judge had been sworn in, one who spoke less and listened more. The court had installed cameras for transparency. Community observers now attended hearings regularly. It was subtle but unmistakable. The room no longer belonged to power, it belonged to the people. And in the heart of downtown, just 2 blocks from that courthouse, a mural stretched across the side of a brick building. It showed Danielle Monroe, standing tall with a folder of court documents under one arm and the scales of justice painted into the folds of her jacket. Beneath her image, a single line read, "She didn't just know the law, she reminded them who it was meant to serve." Danielle never sought fame. She hadn't raised her voice for applause. But when she stood her ground, when she refused to shrink beneath the weight of authority misused, she awakened something far larger than herself. She shifted the culture. Across the country, law schools added her courtroom video to ethics curricula. Judicial panels in other states launched their own reviews, and young women, especially young Black women, began to enter courtrooms with more confidence, knowing someone had stood there before them, not just to challenge a verdict, but to rewrite the rules of engagement. Danielle returned to Washington with more than headlines. She returned with momentum. The Judicial Transparency and Fairness Act, once seen as idealistic, had now become law, and she wasn't finished. Her next bill focused on expanding access to legal counsel in underfunded communities, turning her courtroom confrontation into a national campaign for legal equity. The judge had tried to shame her, the system had tried to silence her, but in the end, Danielle Monroe didn't just defend herself. She redefined the fight, not with rage, but with reason, not with a spotlight, but with a steady voice and a folder full of facts. And from that moment on, no one ever mistook her for someone who would just stand down again. As we reflect on the story of Danielle Monroe, it becomes clear that her experience was never just about a traffic fine or a disrespectful judge. It was about dignity in the face of dismissal and the power of standing firm when the world expects you to back down. And for those of us who have lived through long decades of progress and setbacks, of earned wisdom and silent sacrifices, her story is more than inspiring. It is familiar. Danielle didn't shout. She didn't make demands. She didn't remind the courtroom of her credentials or her title. She did something more powerful. She calmly stood on truth, and she let her character speak before her resume did. How many times in your own life have you faced a situation where you were underestimated, overlooked, or outright disrespected? Perhaps in a workplace, a hospital, or even in your own neighborhood. Danielle's response wasn't just elegant, it was effective. It's a reminder that sometimes grace under pressure is louder than any protest. Many older Americans understand what it means to fight silently, to advocate for their families, to raise children during uncertain times, to speak up for others, even when it costs them. And yet today, in a fast-moving world that often prioritizes noise over nuance, we may feel like we're being pushed aside, as if our time has passed. Danielle reminds us that it hasn't. Her moment in that courtroom turned into a national movement, not because she demanded attention, but because she earned it through composure, clarity, and courage. She used knowledge, not volume, and she let the truth do what it always does, rise to the top, even if slowly. Her legacy, now cemented through a new law and a cultural awakening, isn't about fame. It's about integrity. And it's a testament that change isn't the sole domain of the young. It often comes from the seasoned, from those who have seen enough of life to recognize when a moment calls for courage. For those of us in our golden years, there is a beautiful lesson here. Your voice still matters. Your lived experience, your calm in a crisis, your ability to see through spin and distraction. These are not outdated traits. They are anchors. Anchors our communities need now more than ever. So maybe you're not walking into a courtroom next week, but maybe you'll have a chance to speak up at a community meeting, to stand up for someone in a grocery store, to write a letter, to share your story with a grandchild who doesn't yet know how powerful their voice could be. Let Danielle's story be more than inspiring. Let it be activating. If her courage reminded you of a time you stood tall, or if it stirred something inside you to speak again, press 7 in the comments to let us know you're still standing. And share this video with someone who's forgotten how strong they really are. There's more to come. More stories that show it's never too late to make a difference. Stick with us, and let's keep rewriting the rules, one quiet act of courage at a time.